Zach Laws of Gold Derby here with Howard Shore. He's the composer of the new film, The Song of Names, not to mention countless of your favorite other films. So Howard, this movie is getting ready to come out, so a lot of people are just now going to start getting caught up with what it's about and everything. Just talk a little bit about what drew you to the film and made you want to be a part of it.
Thank you, and good to meet you. I see you've disappeared, but it's just not.
I'm still here, yeah.
All right. I was talking to Robert Lantos, the producer. He introduced me to Francois Girard, whose work I knew from The Red Violin and 32 short films about Glenn Gould. So I thought he was a great director of opera and film, and I really wanted to work with him. The story it covers 50 years from the 30s to the 1980s. And it's a fascinating period. It involved shooting scenes before World War II, during and after the war. And it involves, it's starring a virtuoso violinist. So the music score on screen and the score itself was very appealing to work on the story.
Well, talk a little bit about how all these different things, like the period, the fact that it was a World War II movie, or at least it took place during World War II in certain parts, the fact that there was a violinist in it. How did all of those aspects affect the kind of musical score that you wanted to do for the film?
Right. Well, it offers a really great palette for music, both pieces from the period, mostly from 19th century violin virtuoso pieces of Paganini and the Bruch Concerto. But I had to write a piece for cantor in a pivotal scene for the film that's then developed into The Song of Names, and then is developed into a concert piece for 3 violins and cantor. The score was recorded with in Montreal with the Metropolitan Orchestra, which is a great orchestra, and the violin solos are all performed by Ray Chen. It was wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's such an epic movie in scope, but it's also very intimate. It's about the interpersonal relationships of these people, while also having, the backdrop of like a great war and all that stuff. How did you kind of balance those two elements, the intimate story and also just kind of like the greater conflict that was going on within the film?
Right. I worked for close to 2 years with Francois Girard, choosing the on-screen music. That was really our first goal. And then writing the piece for the cantor, The Song of Names, and then developing the solo violin piece. Once I did that, I then got into the scoring of the film, which is created for this orchestra, the Metropolitan Orchestra, and got into the relationships and the intimacy of the narrative, the storytelling.
Mm-hmm. You've been doing this for such a long time, over 40 years, I think. When you start a project, what is your process of like finding the specific sound that you want to explore within the score?
Right. Well, I like research. I like to read. So I'm off in my research at the beginning. I'm rereading the novel the film is based on, Song of Names by Norman Lebrecht, and then the screenplay by Jeffrey Kane. So well before I'm seeing any of the imagery that Francois created, I'm already working through my process of research, filling my mind and intellect up with the period and the music that we chose for the on-screen performances. And so before I write, I have to do this research. And then I had to go back really to the pivotal scene in the film is 1951 in a synagogue outside of London, Stoke Newington. And I had to create that scene. So I had to go back a bit in my history to that period. And my being brought into the synagogue at that time, my relationship with my father became a very personal story for me. It kind of brought me a little closer to my father, I think.
That's interesting. I mean, do you find personal things like that in all of the films that you do, or was that something that was just exclusive to this one? And did that affect your music?
It definitely affects my music if I find those relationships. And for instance, with the Tolkien, I discovered his love of nature. And Lord of the Rings is so much about everything green and good and preserving nature. And I too had this strong connection to nature. And I think that resonated with me in a way that connected me to the author. In the same way that this did in my history, this story connected with me as a child, and hearing this music and then having it in my head. It was in my DNA, really. And it was just rediscovering it and bringing it out.
So would you say that scene was like the crucial thing that from which the rest of the score sort of extrapolated itself?
Absolutely. Yeah. The Song of the Names, it's a piece that's, without giving the narrative away too much, it's a piece that's central to the story. And it had to be a piece created that was historical, and it felt very, quite a bit of study went into that. And I spent time with two great scholars, Bruce Rubin and Judith Clerman, and they kind of guided me through the modes and the way that the prayers were formed, because these Jewish prayers are part of an oral tradition, and they're passed from person to person. So I had to go back, study as much as I could to be accurate for that scene.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned working with the director Francois Girard, and obviously, like you said, he made The Red Violin and a bunch of operas, and movies that are very music centric. And obviously, operas are very music centric as well. Does it help working with somebody like that who really understands how to use music for dramatic effect?
Very much. Yeah, I enjoy. Francois was a great opera director. He did Parsifal at the Metropolitan Opera in the last few years, and he's doing Flying Dutchman in March at the Metropolitan Opera. Also working on Lohengrin for the Bolshoi and Metropolitan Opera. So, I mean, he's very talented, both film director and opera director. And I'm singing his praises because he sings mine as well. It was such a great collaboration working with him. It was like working with another musician, a really good musician. And we had a really good understanding, and the collaboration developed into a really good friendship now. So these things happen in a very natural way.
You've had a lot of great working relationships with many different directors. I mean, obviously, like David Cronenberg and Martin Scorsese, Peter Jackson on the Lord of the Rings movies, Jonathan Demme on things like Silence of the Lambs. I mean, what does that, having those kind of long-standing relationships with filmmakers, how does that help you as a composer?
Well, you want to build up a kind of working relationship, a language, a shorthand. It doesn't always have to be verbal. It could just be things that we're listening to and that we're both enjoying. But it's good to have a shorthand. It's good to have trust between the composer and the director, and that takes a bit of time to develop. But it's great when you have that, and when you have the longevity of working with a director over a period. There's no really looking back. You're always looking forward. It's always something new, a new story, a new way of telling the story, a new way of using music and to tell the narrative. So it's great when it's a long relationship.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly with somebody like Cronenberg, I mean, you guys have been working together for 40 years. I think since like The Brood was the first time you guys worked together. And I mean, you've been such an integral part of his filmography. What has that relationship given you?
We've done 15 films, I think, over about 30 years. It's wonderful working with him. I mean, he's very great film director, and he's always challenging, in his filmmaking. So he's always looking for new ways to use music, and we've done a lot of experimentation over the years, like films like Crash and Naked Lunch, or even going back to the early works like Videodrome and Scanners. We try a lot of different ways of using music in film, and he's very experimental that way. So he gave me a lot of creative freedom. I enjoyed that.
You've won 3 Oscars for your work on the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Talk a little bit about what that recognition meant for you. And I mean, that music is iconic now. Talk a little bit about what it means to have worked on something that brought you that kind of critical recognition, and also, to have written something that people are still humming in their, in their cars.
It's very gratifying. I get a lot of notes and letters from people all over the world that know this music and love it, and they love Tolkien's work. So I'm gratified by the recognitions that it had received, and it's been a way for me to express really Tolkien's ideas and Peter Jackson's visualization of the novel. It was a way for me to almost put a mirror up to Tolkien's work and create a musical language that expresses his ideas. I used all of his written languages in the film, sung by choir and children's choir and soloists, a way to express the story and the book as clearly and with as much clarity as possible.
You got another Oscar nomination for Hugo. Scorsese is another person you've worked with over and over again, and somebody who really knows how to use music in his films. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think our relationship, I did, with the 5 films I did with Marty, was really through the love of music. I think we both enjoyed working together and discovering ways to use music in films like Hugo or Gangs in New York or The Departed. We did some historical films, like you mentioned, Hugo, and Aviator, which is just around the time of silent films leading into sound films. And I love that period. And so working with him is always a discovery. It's always like looking at other films that are influential to him and also to me, and both our love of music, I think, is central to it. Also, working with Thelma Schoonmaker is a great treat, and I love her, and any time I can spend with Thelma and Marty together is wonderful.
Yeah. Bringing this back to Song of Names, this movie's going to open up at Christmas. What do you hope audiences take away from it and take away from your score?
Well, it's an emotional story. And it has a lot of historical framework, and it's beautifully done. The story's very moving, and I think the darkened theater you enter, the lights go down on the screen, and you enter this world that Francois has created, and it should be a wonderful experience.
And what are you working on now? Anything you can tell us about?
I can tell you a little bit about a film I've been working on with Michelle Hazanavicius called The Lost Prince.
Well, tell us a bit about it.
I won't tell you too much because
Yeah.
it's coming for release in a few months. But it's a beautiful fantasy story. It has humor, and it's just very wonderful, colorful, beautiful film.
Well, I certainly look forward to seeing that. Howard, thank you so much for your time. Congratulations on your work. It's a pleasure.
Good. It's been great being with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, too.